I pressed the device against his chest and pulled the trigger. The crack of electricity split the cold night air like a thunderclap. Every servant in the hallway froze. Every candle seemed to hold its breath. The man before me didn't fall. He didn't stumble. He did not even blink. He simply stood there, tall and immovable as a marble pillar, his dark eyes dropping slowly from the ceiling to my face. And then, God help me, the corner of his mouth curved upward. "Do it again." His voice was low, smooth, almost amused, like a man who had just been offered a second cup of tea, not a second bolt of lightning through his chest. I had trained for 3 years inside the walls of the Royal Intelligence Bureau. I had disarmed men twice my size. I had outwitted generals, forged royal seals, and once escaped a burning building in nothing but my petticoat. Nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared me for this. For him. Damien Ashcroft, the Duke of Blackmere, the most feared and untouchable nobleman in all of England, was smirking at my weapon like it was a toy. I raised my chin. My hand didn't shake, even though everything inside me was shaking violently. "Your Grace," I said, keeping my voice ice-cold and steady. I said, "Hands in the air." He tilted his head, slowly, like a wolf deciding whether the creature before him was prey or something far more interesting. "No," he said simply, and that was the moment I understood that this mission, this man, and this night were going to change everything. "Now, before we go further, tell me this. Would you have pulled the trigger a second time? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. If this story already has your heart racing, hit the subscribe button right now. You do not want to miss what comes next. I didn't go to Blackmir Manor looking for trouble. Trouble, however, had been waiting for me at the front gate, leaning against the iron post with his arms folded and his jaw set like carved stone, watching me climb down from the hired carriage as though I were the most inconvenient thing that had ever arrived on his property. I had my orders. A sealed letter from Director Hurrick himself, pressed into my gloved hand at dawn that very morning, before the city had even woken up properly. The wax seal had been stamped twice, which meant the matter was urgent. The fact that it had been handed to me specifically, Countess Thea Drummond, or not to any of the male agents who sat comfortably behind their desks at the bureau drinking warm coffee and pretending to file reports, meant the matter was also delicate. Delicate was my specialty. The letter had said 3 things. First, that the Duke of Blackmere was suspected of receiving stolen government documents related to a military treaty between England and a foreign crown. Second, that 2 previous agents sent to investigate had returned to London without their evidence, one of them without his dignity as well. Third, that I was to retrieve the documents, secure the truth, and return within 5 days without causing a diplomatic incident. It had not said anything about what to do if the Duke himself opened the front door before I even knocked. But there he was. Damien Ashcroft was not what I had expected, and I had expected quite a lot. The Bureau's file on him had been thick enough to use as a doorstop. I had read every page on the carriage ride over, studying his history the way a surgeon studies a wound before cutting. Born the second son of the late Duke of Blackmere, inherited the title at 19 after his elder brother died, under circumstances that the file described only as disputed. Had served briefly in the military before resigning his commission, again under circumstances the file called disputed. Had since spent the better part of a decade accumulating political influence, land, and a reputation so dark and so wide that even senior lords at court went quiet when his name entered a room. None of that had prepared me for the actual man. He was tall in a way that felt deliberate, like height was something he used as a strategy. His coat was dark, well-fitted, and utterly without ornament, which somehow made him look more powerful than if he had been draped in medals. His hair was black and slightly longer than fashion allowed, which told me he did not much care what fashion allowed, and his face, sharp-boned and unreadable, carried the kind of stillness that was not peace. It was control, the particular, practiced stillness of a man who had taught himself never to reveal what he was thinking. His eyes, though. His eyes were the problem. They were dark, almost black in the grey morning light, and when they landed on me, they did not move away again. They did not flick to my carriage, or to my bag, or to the letter I held. They stayed on my face with an intensity that made me feel, very unpleasantly, or that he was reading something written there that I had not chosen to show him. I squared my shoulders and walked toward him. "Your Grace," I said, and my voice came out exactly as I intended. Cool, composed, faintly bored, as though dukes were something I encountered before breakfast every Tuesday. "I am Countess Thea Drummond. I believe you received correspondence from the Bureau regarding my visit." "I received something," he said. His voice was exactly as I remembered it from the previous night, low and unhurried, filling the space around it without effort. I did not agree to it. I stopped 2 feet from him and met his gaze without flinching. "With respect, Your Grace, my assignment does not require your agreement." Something shifted behind his eyes. Not anger. Something more careful than anger, and somehow more dangerous. "Just come inside," he said. He turned and walked back through the door without waiting to see if I would follow. I followed, because I had a job to do, and because standing alone on his front steps would have been a poor start to 5 days of undercover work. But I noticed, as I stepped into the entrance hall of Blackmir Manor and heard the great door swing shut behind me, that the house was very quiet. Not the quiet of a household at rest, the quiet of a household that had been told to make itself scarce. That was my first warning. The second warning came 3 minutes later, when he led me into his study, closed the door, and turned to look at me with an expression that told me clearly he already knew exactly who I was and why I had been sent. "You are not here to catalogue my library," he said. It was not a question. "No," I said, because there was no point pretending otherwise with a man who was looking at me like that. "I am not." He moved to the window. Outside, the grounds of Blackmir were vast and grey and perfectly maintained, the kind of grounds that took an army of staff to keep in order. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at them, and for a moment I thought he was collecting himself. Then he said, "The documents you are looking for are not here." I kept my expression neutral. "Then you know what I am looking for." "I know what Harwick thinks I have." He turned from the window. "He is wrong. Men who are innocent," I said carefully, "rarely know the precise nature of the accusations against them before those accusations have been formally presented." The corner of his mouth moved. That same slight curve from the night before, or the one that was not quite a smile and was somehow more unsettling than one. "I am rarely anything so simple as innocent," he said, "but in this particular matter, I am telling you the truth." I did not believe him. Not then. I was trained not to believe anyone immediately, and especially not to believe charming, controlled men in well-fitted coats who answered questions they had not been asked. But I also noted that he had not tried to have me removed. He had not summoned his solicitor. He had not threatened. He had simply told me, directly, that the documents were not there, and then he had watched me with those dark eyes, to see what I would do next. What I did next was sit down in the chair across from his desk, cross my ankles and say, "Then you will not object to my remaining here for several days while I confirm that for myself." He looked at me for a long moment. "You are either very brave," he said, "or very foolish." "I have been called both," I said pleasantly, "usually by men who turned out to be wrong." He sat down across from me then, slowly, and for the first time something in the controlled stillness of his face shifted into something that was, unless I was completely mistaken, the very earliest edge of genuine interest. "5 days," he said. "5 days," I agreed. "Then we had better establish the terms." And that was how I came to be a guest of the Duke of Blackmere, in a house full of secrets and silences, and staff who looked at me like they pitied me, but on a mission that I was already beginning to understand was far more complicated than Director Harwick's sealed letter had suggested. I had pressed a weapon to this man's chest the night before, and watched him smile at it. Now I was sitting across a desk from him in the cold morning light, negotiating the terms of my own investigation into him, and trying very hard not to notice that he was looking at me the same way he had looked at the weapon. Like I was something that interested him, like I was something he had not encountered before. I told myself it did not matter. I had a job. I had 5 days. I had trained for exactly this kind of situation, where the subject was difficult and the stakes were high and nothing was going to be easy. What I had not trained for was the knock at the study door 30 seconds later, and the woman who opened it without waiting for an answer, and the way everything in the room changed the moment she walked in. She was perhaps 50, with silver hair pinned severely at her neck, and eyes that moved over me like a blade over cloth, cutting and assessing in one smooth motion. She wore the bearing of someone who had given orders in this house for a very long time, and had never once been refused. "Damien," she said, not looking at him, still looking at me. "Who is this?" "Aunt Bernice," he said, and there was something new in his voice, something careful. "This is Countess Drummond. She will be staying with us for a few days." Lady Bernice Ashcroft turned her gaze to her nephew then, and the look that passed between them was fast and layered and full of something I could not yet read. "I see," she said, and then she looked back at me and smiled, and the smile was the most alarming thing I had encountered all morning, which was saying something considerable given how my morning had begun. "Welcome to Blackmir, Countess," she said. "I do hope you survive it." I was given a room on the 2nd floor, east wing, with a window that looked out over the garden and a lock on the door that I tested 3 times before I was satisfied it was functional. My bag had already been brought up by a footman who had said nothing and looked at the floor the entire time he carried it, which told me the staff had been warned about me, or warned about something, and that the warning had made them cautious. I unpacked only what I needed: my personal items, my notebooks, and the small leather case that held the tools of my actual work, which I slid beneath a loose board under the bed that I had identified by pressing my heel along the floor in a slow grid pattern the moment I was left alone. Old habit. The bureau had taught me to always find the hiding place before I needed it. Then I stood at the window and looked out at the garden and thought about Lady Bernice Ashcroft and her parting smile and what she had meant by it. "I hope you survive it." It could have been a joke. Rich households sometimes had a dark sense of humor about their own reputations. It could have been a warning, or it could have been something in between, one of those statements that functioned as both at once, depending on what the person receiving it chose to do with it. I had not yet decided which it was when there was a knock at my door. I crossed the room, did not open it immediately, and said, "Who is it?" "Petra," said the voice on the other side. Young, female, slightly out of breath, as though she had climbed the stairs too quickly. "I am to be your lady's maid during your stay, my lady. His Grace's instructions." I opened the door. She was perhaps 19, with a round, honest face, and the kind of eyes that gave too much away, wide and quick and darting to the corners of the room behind me, with an anxiety she was clearly trying to conceal. Her uniform was neat. Her hands, clasped in front of her, were trembling very slightly. "Come in, Petra," I said, and stepped back. She came in, and I closed the door behind her, and I watched her move to the wardrobe and begin unnecessarily rearranging the few things I had already hung there, and I let her do it for a moment, because nervous people who are busy with their hands sometimes talk when they mean to stay quiet. I was right. "You should know," she said, her back to me, her voice very low, "that the room next to yours is not empty." I said nothing. I waited. "It has been empty for 2 years," she continued, smoothing the same jacket she had already smoothed twice. "Since Lady Ashcroft died. The late Duchess, I mean, not Lady Bernice. Everyone here knows not to go in it. But last night, before you arrived, I heard footsteps inside it." She stopped smoothing. Heavy footsteps, not a maid's. I looked at the wall that separated my room from the one beside it. "Thank you, Petra," I said quietly. She turned around then, and the relief on her face was enormous, like she had been holding something heavy for a long time and had just been allowed to set it down. "Be careful, my lady," she said. "This house is not what it looks like from the outside." That I already knew. After she left, I pressed my ear briefly to the wall that adjoined the next room and heard nothing. That meant nothing. Silence in old houses was a skill, not an absence. I made a note in my book, dressed for dinner with the precise calculation of a woman who understood that dinner in a house like this was never just dinner, and went downstairs. The dining room was large enough to feel absurd for 2 people, but it had been set for 4, which told me before anyone arrived that there would be guests I had not been informed about. The long table was dark walnut, the candles were already lit, and Damien Ashcroft was already standing at the far end of the room with a glass of something amber, watching the fire. He did not turn around when I entered, but he said, "You dressed for war." I looked down at myself, and then back at him. "I dressed for dinner." Same thing here, most nights. He turned then, and his eyes moved over me once, briefly, in that same reading way that I had already decided I disliked, because it made me feel transparent. "Sit where you like. My aunt will put you where she wants you, regardless." I chose the chair with my back to the wall and a clear sightline to the door, which was not where Lady Bernice put me when she arrived 4 minutes later with 2 men behind her that I had never seen before. "Countess Drummond," she said, gesturing smoothly to the chair to Damien's immediate right. "Here, please, as we do not stand on ceremony at Blackmir." The 2 men who had entered with her were introduced quickly. The first was Lord Prentice Gould, a heavy-set man of perhaps 45, with the red complexion of someone who spent too much time near a fire or a bottle, and the sharp, practiced manners of a man in politics. He shook my hand with exactly the right amount of pressure, and smiled with exactly the right number of teeth, and everything about him was so precisely correct that I trusted him immediately less than I trusted anyone else in the room. The second man was younger, perhaps 30, with light eyes and a restless quality about him, like a greyhound that had been asked to sit still. He was introduced as Mr. Callum Drew, and he was apparently Gould's personal secretary, a fact that Gould mentioned twice in the first 2 minutes, which made me wonder why he felt the need to establish it so firmly. We sat, wine was poured, the first course arrived, and for perhaps 10 minutes the conversation was a masterclass in saying absolutely nothing in a great many words, the kind of effortless social performance that the English upper class had perfected over centuries of not wanting to discuss anything real over food. Then Lord Gould set down his fork, looked at me pleasantly, and said, "I understand you are here on behalf of the Bureau, Countess." The table went quiet in the particular way tables go quiet when something has just been said that was not supposed to be said yet. I looked at Gould. I looked at Callum Drew, who was looking at his plate. I looked at Lady Bernice, who was expressionless. And then I looked at Damien Ashcroft, who was looking at Gould with an expression I had not seen on him before, something flat and very cold, like the surface of a frozen river. "I am here as a personal guest," I said, pleasantly and clearly. "The Countess Drummond has long admired the Blackmir library." "Of course," said Gould and smiled. "Forgive me. I must have been mistaken." He had not been mistaken, and we all knew it. The question was how he had known, and who had told him, and why he had chosen to say it out loud at the dinner table, like a man laying down a card he wanted everyone to see. I ate my next course, and said little and watched everything. Callum Drew drank more than he ate. Lady Bernice watched her nephew. Her nephew watched Gould. And Gould watched me with the comfortable, unhurried attention of a man who believed he held an advantage. After dinner, when the men had gone to the study for brandy, and Lady Bernice had excused herself, I didn't go upstairs. Instead, I went to the east corridor, where Petra had told me before dinner that the household staff kept their records and keys, and I found the ring of spare keys on the hook where she said it would be, and I took the one that was labelled in faded ink with a single letter. The letter was E. The late Duchess had been named Eleanor. I went back upstairs. The corridor was empty. I stood in front of the door to the room next to mine and listened for 30 seconds. Nothing. I put the key in the lock. It turned. The room beyond was dark and cold and smelled of old roses and something sharper underneath, like candle wax burned down to nothing. I moved inside, pulled the door nearly shut behind me, and let my eyes adjust. And the room had been preserved. That was the first thing I understood. The furniture was covered in white sheets, but the sheets were clean and recently placed, not dusty and forgotten. Someone had been in this room and had cared for it deliberately, keeping it like a stage set, waiting for a performance. I moved to the writing desk in the corner and eased open the top drawer. Empty. The second drawer. Empty. The third, the deep one at the bottom, was locked. I had a pin in my hair for exactly these occasions. It took me 40 seconds. The drawer opened. Inside was a single sealed envelope, thick with whatever was folded inside it, and written on the front in a hand I did not recognize were 4 words that made my chest go very still. "For when he breaks." I was reaching for it when the floorboard behind me gave a soft, unmistakable creak. I spun around. Damien Ashcroft stood in the doorway that connected this room to the one beside it through a hidden interior door I had not found because I had not known to look for it. He was without his coat now, his collar loosened, and he was holding a single candle that threw long shadows up across his face and made his expression impossible to read. He looked at the drawer. He looked at the envelope in my hand. And then he looked at me. "Put it down," he said. His voice was very quiet, quieter than I had heard before, not threatening, something far more complicated than threatening. "Whose writing is this?" I asked. I did not put it down. He looked at the envelope for a long moment, and something crossed his face that was gone before I could properly name it, on something old and deep and painful in the way that only things which have been carried a very long time become. "My wife's," he said. The candle flame moved between us in the draught. "She left it for you," I said. "She left it," he said, "for whoever came looking." He lifted his gaze from the envelope to my face, and the expression there was the first entirely unguarded thing I had seen from him since I arrived. She knew someone would come eventually. She knew what I was involved in. She knew more than I told her, because she always did. He stopped. She was trying to protect me. Even then. Even at the end. I stood very still in the dark room that smelled of old roses and held a dead woman's last message, and I looked at the Duke of Blackmere, and for the first time since I had pressed a device to his chest and watched him dare me to do it again, I did not know what to do next. I knew what my training said. Secure the evidence. Do not engage emotionally with the subject. Report back to Harwick. But training had not accounted for the look on his face in the candlelight, or for the fact that the envelope was addressed to no one and everyone at once, or for the growing, deeply inconvenient certainty building quietly inside me that Damien Ashcroft hadn't stolen those documents. He had been protecting something too. "Tell me," I said, "from the beginning. All of it." He looked at me for a long time. The candle burned between us. Somewhere below us, Lord Gould was drinking the Duke's brandy in the Duke's study, and he did not know that upstairs, in a room that smelled of roses and old grief, everything was about to shift. Damien Ashcroft pulled the door fully open between our rooms and said, "You had better sit down." I sat in the chair nearest the covered window, and he sat on the edge of the sheeted bed, and he began to talk. He did not ease into it. He did not offer pleasantries or preamble. He simply started, the way a man starts when he has been holding something so long that the moment someone asks, the words come out like water through a broken dam. 18 months ago, he said, a man named Colonel Silas Brine came to me with a proposal. I knew that name. Brine had been decorated twice, court-favoured, and was currently serving as military liaison between the War Office and the Crown's foreign advisers. He was also, what according to a small notation in the Bureau's files that most agents would have skimmed past, under quiet internal review for financial irregularities. I had not skimmed past it. He told me, Damien continued, that a treaty being negotiated between England and the Northern Alliance contained a clause that would effectively hand 3 English coastal garrison posts to foreign administrative control. Quietly, buried in language that most of the lords who would vote on it would never read carefully enough to catch. I kept my face still. And he came to you because? Because I had read it. His jaw tightened. I sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee. I received the treaty draft for review. I read every word, which apparently made me unusual enough to become a problem. He looked at his hands. Brine came to tell me, very politely, that my concerns were unfounded, that I had misread the clause, that a man of my particular history, with my particular reputation, would be wise not to raise objections publicly. He threatened you. He suggested, Damien said, with a cold precision that told me the distinction mattered to him, that if I made noise, certain disputed elements of my past would become considerably less disputed, and considerably more public. I thought of the Bureau's file, disputed circumstances. Twice. Your brother, I said quietly. Something moved behind his eyes. My brother's death was an accident. I have never claimed otherwise. But accidents, when they happen to heirs, and when the man left standing is already considered difficult, can be made to look like many things by people who are motivated to look. "So you stayed quiet," I said. "I stayed quiet," he said, "and I made copies." I straightened very slightly. "Of the treaty draft. Of everything. The draft, Brine's visit, a letter he sent me afterward through a third party. 2 subsequent meetings I documented without his knowledge." He looked at me steadily. "Those are the documents Harwick thinks I stole. I didn't steal them. They were given to me as part of my committee review. I copied them because I knew if I raised the alarm through official channels, they would disappear before anyone with real authority could see them." I sat with that for a moment. "Where are they?" I asked. "Safe," he said. "Not in this house. I am not careless." "And you were planning to do what with them?" "Exactly. To keep them under a floorboard until the treaty passes and England quietly hands over 3 garrison posts to foreign control." His eyes sharpened. I was waiting for the right person. "And the right person," I said slowly, "was not the 2 agents Harwick sent before me. The first one took a payment from Gould's man within 12 hours of arriving," he said. "The second one was Brine's nephew. I recognized him at the gate." He paused. I was beginning to think Harwick was either incompetent or compromised. "And now?" He looked at me the way he had looked at me in the entrance hall that first morning, reading something in my face I had not chosen to show. "And now I think he sent you, because he ran out of men he trusted and decided to try something different." I did not tell him that was almost exactly what Harwick had said to me. Well, I said instead, "Lord Gould. He is here because he knows you have the copies. He has been circling for weeks. He arrived yesterday, 1 day before you, which tells me Brine warned him that another agent was coming." His voice was even, but there was something beneath it, something clipped and controlled, that told me the sight of Gould at his dinner table cost him more composure than he was showing. "Gould does not know exactly what I have or where it is, but he knows enough to be dangerous. And his secretary, Callum Drew. Drew is not a secretary." Damien said it flatly, with the certainty of someone who had already confirmed it. "He carries no correspondence, takes no notes, and has twice been observed near the staff entrance at hours when no secretary has business being there. He is here to search the house." I looked at the envelope still in my hand. Eleanor's envelope, for when he breaks. "She knew all of this," I said. "Your wife." His expression did not collapse, but it changed in the way that deeply controlled things change when they are touched in the right place. Slowly, irreversibly. "She found the copies I had made. I did not tell her. She simply found them, the way she found everything, by being far more perceptive than anyone gave her credit for." He was quiet for a moment. "She told me to trust someone. She said I could not carry it alone indefinitely. That was the last real conversation we had, before she became too ill to have conversations." I looked at the envelope. "She wrote that for you," I said again. "Not for the next agent. For you. She knew you would be the one to open it, eventually, when you finally decided to let someone in." He said nothing. I set the envelope carefully on the covered nightstand beside him and stood up. "I need to contact Harwick," I said. "Securely. Not through the house's usual messenger." "Petra," he said immediately. "She has a brother who rides. He is not connected to the house, officially." Of course he knew that. He had known it, and held it in reserve, waiting to see if he would need it. Waiting to see if I was worth using it on. "First light," I said. "And tonight, we need to know what Drew is looking for in the East Corridor." Damien stood. He was close, closer than he had been at the desk that morning, and the candlelight between us was very small, and the room was very quiet. "We," he said. Not a question. Something else. A something that acknowledged a shift had occurred that neither of us had formally agreed to, but both of us already understood. "We," I said, and picked up the candle and walked back through the connecting door into my own room. I lay down without sleeping and listened to the house breathe around me and thought about copies of a dangerous treaty and a dead woman who had known her husband better than he knew himself, and a man who had smiled at a weapon pressed to his chest because he had already decided that he had very little left to lose. I thought about that last part for rather too long before I made myself stop. At 2 a.m, the footsteps started in the East Corridor. I was out of bed and at my door in 3 seconds. I eased it open. The corridor was dark, except for the thin, moving line of a shielded lamp being carried slowly along the wall, pausing at each door, testing each handle. Drew. He was methodical and quiet, and if I had been asleep, I would not have heard him at all. I stepped back. I did not confront him. Not yet. I needed to know which room he stopped at, and how long he spent there, and what he was specifically looking for, and a confrontation in a dark corridor at 2 a.m. would end the investigation before it produced anything useful. He stopped at the door to Eleanor's room. He had a key. Not the one I had taken from the staff corridor, a different one. Smaller. Privately held, which meant either he had been given it by someone inside the house, or he had taken it from somewhere I had not found yet. He went inside. I counted to 20, moved silently to the door, and pressed my ear against it. Drawers opening. The specific sound of someone who knows what they are looking for and is frustrated not to find it. Then a pause. Then the sound of the locked bottom drawer being tried and found already open. A sharp exhale. He had found the empty drawer. He had known about the envelope, and now he knew someone had gotten there first. I moved back to my doorway in 4 silent steps, and was inside with the door nearly closed by the time Eleanor's room opened again, and Drew came back into the corridor. He did not move toward the stairs. He moved toward Damien's room. I did not think. I opened my door. "Mr. Drew," I said, loudly enough to carry but evenly, as though I had simply stepped out for air. "What an unusual hour for a walk." He stopped. In the faint light from the window at the corridor's end, I could see his expression recalibrate in real time, the caught look shifting rapidly to something composed and faintly apologetic. "Countess," he said, "forgive me. I could not sleep." "Nor could I said pleasantly. "These old houses are so full of sounds, are they not? Drawers opening, footsteps, keys turning." I smiled at him. "I find a warm drink helps. I am sure Mrs. Hadlow would not mind if you asked the kitchen." A beat of silence. "Quite," he said. "Good evening, Countess." He walked to the stairs and went down, and I stood in the corridor until I could no longer hear him, and then I turned and found Damien Ashcroft standing in his own doorway, watching me with an expression that was several things at once. "You just told him you know," he said quietly. "I told him I know without telling him what I know," I said. "Oh, there is a difference. Now he has to report back to Gould, and Gould has to decide whether to move quickly or carefully, and whichever he chooses tells us something about how much time we have." Damien was quiet for a moment. "You are rather good at this." "I am exceptionally good at this," I said, and went back into my room, And this time I did sleep, lightly and briefly, with one ear still open to the house. Morning arrived with rain and the sound of raised voices below stairs, which was how I learned, before Petra even brought my water up, that Lord Gould had demanded access to the Manor's record room and been refused. Petra told me the rest while she pinned my hair. Her hands were steadier than the night before, which meant she had slept, which meant she trusted the situation slightly more than she had 24 hours ago. That was useful. His Grace told Lord Gould that the record room was under legal review by the estate solicitor, she said, and that no one, not even a guest, could enter until the review was complete. "Is that true?" I asked. "No," she said simply, and caught my eye in the mirror, and we shared a brief moment of understanding. "Your brother," I said. "Can he ride to London today?" "He can leave within the hour." "Good." I reached into my pocket and gave her the folded note I had written before dawn. Sealed. Addressed to a name that was not Harwick's, but that Harwick would recognize as mine. "This goes directly to him, not to the Bureau's front office, to him personally." She tucked it into her apron without looking at it. "Yes, of my lady." After she left, I went downstairs and found the breakfast room occupied by Lady Bernice and Lord Gould, and a very deliberate absence of Callum Drew, which told me Drew had either left early or was somewhere in the house he was not supposed to be. "Countess Drummond," said Gould, rising with his precisely correct manners. "I trust you slept well." "Wonderfully," I said, and took the seat furthest from him and nearest the door. Lady Bernice poured my tea herself, which was not something a woman of her position did by accident. It was a statement. I was being claimed, quietly, as her concern, and not Gould's. I accepted the tea and noted it. Damien arrived 10 minutes later, and the temperature in the room changed when he walked in, the way temperature always changed around him, like the air itself made an adjustment. He took his seat at the head of the table and looked at Gould with the flat, river ice expression I had now seen enough times to catalogue. "I have been thinking," said Gould, as though they were resuming a conversation, "that perhaps we have been approaching this situation incorrectly." "Have you?" said Damien. "Not a question. There are matters of mutual concern here, documents that certain parties believe you hold, documents that, were they to surface in the wrong hands, could embarrass a number of people." He spread his hands. "It seems to me a resolution could be found that benefits everyone." "You want to buy them," I said. Gould looked at me with the careful attention of a man who had decided to be surprised that a woman had spoken plainly. "I want to find a solution, Countess." "The solution," said Damien, setting down his cup with a quietness that was somehow louder than any raised voice, "is that you leave my house by noon." Gould's pleasant expression did not move. That was what told me he was dangerous. Dangerous men do not flinch at refusals, they simply reroute. "I see," he said. "I had hoped we might be more civilized." "You sent a man to search my home at 2 a.m, said Damien. "We are past civilized." Gould folded his napkin and stood. "I will send for my carriage." He looked at me as he pushed in his chair, and the look was long enough and pointed enough to be a message. "Safe travels, Countess. The roads from Blackmere can be unpredictable." He left. Lady Bernice looked at her tea. I looked at Damien. Damien looked at the door Gould had just walked through, and then, after a moment, looked at me. "He's not actually leaving," I said. "No," he agreed. "He will take a room at the village inn and wait for instruction from Brine." Which gives us, perhaps, 2 days before Brine decides to stop being subtle. I set down my cup. "I need to see the copies. Today. All of them." Something passed across his expression. Not reluctance. Something more like resolve, the look of a man stepping off a ledge he has been standing at the edge of for a long time. "After dark," he said. "I will take you to them." Lady Bernice spoke then, for the first time since Gould had left the room. "Damien," she said quietly. "Are you certain?" He looked at his aunt, and something in that look told me that Lady Bernice had known about the copies, had known for some time, had been protecting the secret in her own way, with her sharp eyes and her careful positioning, and managing this household through months of encircling the threat the way a general manages a siege from the inside. "I am certain," he said. She nodded once, and then she looked at me, and the smile she gave me this time was nothing like the one from the first evening. This one was real, small and real and weighted with relief. "Then I will make sure dinner takes a very long time tonight," she said, "and that Mrs. Hadlow requires the footman in the kitchen for the whole of it." I spent the rest of the day being visible. I walked to the library. I asked the head groundsman about the rose gardens. I had a long, unhurried conversation with the estate's elderly archivist, Mr. Bunce, about the history of the Ashcroft family's land holdings, and I listened to every word he said and remembered most of it. But because old men who have served great houses for 40 years know where everybody is buried, sometimes literally, Mr. Bunce, it turned out, knew a great deal. He knew that Eleanor Ashcroft had spent the last year of her life writing letters that were never sent, that she had dismissed her personal maid 6 months before she died and managed her own correspondence after that, that 2 weeks before her death she had asked Bunce himself to notarize a document she would not show him, only the signature page, and that she had seemed, he said, looking at the garden as he remembered it. Not afraid, but very determined. Very decided. I thanked Mr. Bunce and went upstairs and opened Eleanor's envelope. I had not opened it before. I had left it on the nightstand for Damien. But when I went back to the room to check something, the envelope was gone, and I assumed he had taken it. Now I realized I had never confirmed that, and in the daylight the room looked different, slightly disturbed in ways that had nothing to do with my visit the night before. Someone else had been in Eleanor's room today. Someone who had not found what they were looking for at 2 a.m. and had come back to look more carefully. Drew had not left with Gould. I went through the room fast and thorough, the way the bureau had trained me, checking every surface and hollow and seam, under the mattress, behind the wardrobe backing, inside the hollow curtain rod above the window. Nothing had been taken, nothing visible. But the room had been searched by someone who knew how to search, and the only thing that had been in the room worth taking was the envelope, and the envelope was gone. I went directly to Damien's study. I didn't knock. He looked up from the papers on his desk and read my expression in half a second. "What happened?" "Eleanor's envelope," I said. "Did you take it from the nightstand last night?" He was very still. "No," he said. "I left it where you put it. I was not ready to open it." We looked at each other. "Drew still has access to the house," I said. "He did not leave. He is still here somewhere, and he has the envelope." Damien stood. All the careful, controlled stillness collapsed into something sharp and immediate. "That envelope," he said, and his voice was very low, "contains Eleanor's personal account of everything she witnessed in this house during the months she was dying. Names, dates, conversations she overheard. It is not evidence I made. It is evidence she gathered." He stopped. "If Brian sees that document, he will know exactly how much I have, and he will not wait for subtlety." "Then we have less time than 2 days," I said. "We have tonight," he said. Outside the study window, the rain had stopped. Somewhere in the village, Lord Gould was sitting in a hired room, waiting for instruction. Somewhere in this house, Callum Drew was reading a dead woman's words and understanding for the first time exactly what he was dealing with. And somewhere between this moment and darkness, I had to figure out how to outmaneuver all of it. I looked at Damien Ashcroft and he looked back at me, and neither of us looked away, and the air between us was full of urgency, and something else that I didn't name, and something that had been building since a cold night, and a crackle of electricity, and a man who had smiled at danger and asked for more. "Tonight," I said. "Show me everything." He took me out through the kitchen passage at 9:30, when Lady Bernice had successfully convinced Mrs. Hadlow that the evening's pudding required the personal attention of every footman in the house. The rain had left the grounds cold and smelling of wet earth, and the path Damien led me down ran behind the stables and through a gap in the old stone wall that I would never have found on my own. I followed close. I did not ask where we were going. I had learned, in 4 days inside Blackmir, that Damien Ashcroft answered questions better when he was not asked them directly. The groundskeeper's cottage sat at the far edge of the property, half hidden behind a stand of oaks that had grown so tall and so dense they blocked out the sky above it. It looked abandoned. The shutters were drawn. No light showed anywhere. But when Damien pressed his hand flat against the stone beside the door, in a specific place, and with a specific pressure, I heard something shift inside. A mechanism, old and well-oiled, and the door swung inward. I stepped inside after him. The room beyond was small, dry, and warm from a banked fire. 1 table, 2 chairs, a locked iron box bolted to the floor in the corner, with a chain around it thick enough to moor a ship. "My father built this room," Damien said, lighting the lamp on the table. "He used it to store the estate's deed copies during a legal dispute that lasted 11 years. No one alive on the staff knows it exists except Bunce, and Bunce has kept secrets for this family since before I was born." He crouched at the iron box and worked the lock with a key he wore around his neck, under his shirt, against his skin. 3 turns left, 2 right, 1 left. The box opened. Inside was a leather satchel, flat and compact and tied with cord. He lifted it out and set it on the table and stood back. "Everything," he said. I sat down and opened it. The treaty draft was on top, 40 pages of dense legal language, and I read fast, the way the Bureau had taught me, scanning for structure and flagging the weight-bearing clauses. I found the garrison clause on page 29, buried in a subsection about administrative cooperation, written in language so deliberately vague it could mean almost anything to a casual reader, and meant exactly one thing to anyone reading carefully. There were 3 posts, named specifically in an attached schedule that itself was labelled as a supplementary notation and not a primary term, which meant it would not appear in the summary documents circulated to the full Lords Committee. It was elegant in the way that corruption is sometimes elegant. Someone had worked very hard on this. Behind the treaty draft were Damien's notes from Colonel Brine's visit, written in a precise hand on plain paper, dated and timed with the habit of someone who had always known they might need to prove something later. Then Brine's follow-up letter, delivered through a shipping merchant whose name I recognized from a separate Bureau investigation into war supply fraud. Then 2 more pages, these handwritten in a different hand entirely, smaller and slightly uneven, the hand of someone writing with effort, or to Eleanor's hand. I looked up at Damien. He was standing at the window with his back to me. and I understood that he could not watch me read those pages. I read them quietly. Eleanor Ashcroft had not been a passive observer of her husband's trouble. She had been, in the months before her death, a deliberate and methodical recorder of everything she could reach from the confines of a sick room. She had noted dates when Brian's men visited the estate. She had written down names she overheard from her window when voices carried across the garden. She had listed, in careful order, 3 names beyond Brian that she believed were part of the scheme. Names I didn't have. Names that the Bureau's file had not mentioned. One of them was Lord Prentice Gould. One of them was a senior clerk at the Foreign Office named Desmond Fitch, whose name I knew because he had signed the treaty's administrative schedule. The third name made me stop. Director Harwick. I sat with that for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then I put the pages down very carefully and looked at the back of Damien's head and said, "You knew about Harwick." He turned around. I suspected. Eleanor confirmed it. "You let me send a message to him this morning." "I let you send a message to the name you addressed it to," he said, which was not Harwick's name. I thought back to the note I had written before dawn, the name I had used, the intermediary I had chosen because Harwick had told me 3 years ago during my first assignment that this particular contact was to be used only if I had reason to doubt the chain of command above me. Harwick had told me that himself, and now I understood he had done it as a safeguard that could be used against him as easily as for him. If I had doubted him and used that name, the message would reach someone who reported directly to the Home Secretary, bypassing Harwick entirely. Damien had known that. He had known it, and said nothing, and let me make the choice myself. "You were testing me," I said. "I was trusting you," he said. "There is a difference." It was the same distinction he had drawn about Brian's threat, and I understood now that it was not a verbal habit. It was the precise and important line between 2 things that Damien Ashcroft had learned, at considerable cost, to keep separate. I stood up. "The message will reach the Home Secretary's office by tomorrow morning, if your man rides through the night." "He will ride through the night," Damien said. "Petra made sure of that." I looked at the satchel on the table. "We cannot leave these here. If Drew found the cottage, and he is thorough enough that I would not assume he has not looked, the box buys us hours, not days." "I know," he said. "I have been thinking about that. We need to move them tonight. Somewhere Drew cannot search without exposing himself entirely." Damien was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is a place, but it requires that you trust me with something inconvenient." "Everything about this has been inconvenient," I said. "Go on." "The parish church in the village has a vestry with a floor safe that my father endowed during a restoration 40 years ago. The vicar is 91 years old and has not left the church in a decade and does not receive guests. He also," Damien said, with a precision that told me this was the relevant detail, "is Lady Bernice's godfather and has kept the Ashcroft family's private records for longer than anyone now living can verify." "You want to walk a government evidence satchel through the village at 10 at night in the rain?" "I want to walk it through my own grounds to the back of the churchyard wall," he said, "which shares a gate with the vestry garden. There is no road involved. No one will see us who is not already watching this house, and anyone watching this house is already watching the front, not the back 40 acres. I picked up the satchel. "Then let us go." We went out through the oaks and across the lower field, moving fast and quiet through the wet grass, the lamp shuttered to a thin line of light that Damien held low against the ground. He moved like someone who had walked this land the night before, sure-footed and without hesitation, and I kept close and watched the tree line on our left and said nothing. The churchyard gate was iron, old and silent on its hinges, which told me it was oiled regularly. The vestry door opened before we knocked, which told me someone had been watching for us, and the someone was a small, extremely old man in a wool dressing gown, who looked at Damien with the unsurprised eyes of a man who had expected this visit for some time. "Vicar Aldous," said Damien quietly, "I am sorry for the hour." "You are your father's son," said Vicar Aldous, which appeared to settle the matter entirely. He stepped back. We went in. The vestry floor safe took 4 minutes to open. The satchel went inside. The safe was closed. Vicar Aldous handed Damien the key and then looked at me with eyes that were very old and very clear. "You will do," he said, which I took as a compliment. We walked back across the field faster than we had come. The house was dark and quiet when we reached it, and we came in through the kitchen passage and stopped in the narrow hallway where the lamp hooks were, and Damien shuttered the light, and we stood in the dark for a moment while our eyes adjusted. He was very close, the way the hallway required, and the house was very quiet, and I was aware of his breathing and the warmth of him, and the fact that the careful, controlled distance he had maintained between us for 4 days had, somewhere across a wet field in the dark, disappeared entirely. "Thea," he said. He used my name, not my title, just my name, quiet and direct, of the way he said everything that actually mattered. I did not answer right away, because the way he said it required a moment to absorb properly. "When this is over," he said, "I would like to have a conversation that does not involve stolen treaties or men searching my house in the dark." "What would that conversation be about?" I asked. He looked at me in the dark for a moment. "I have not decided yet. I thought I would see if you were interested in having it first." Something shifted in my chest, quiet and significant, like a lock turning over. "I am interested," I said. We went upstairs separately, and I lay down on my bed in the dark and looked at the ceiling and did not sleep for a very long time, and this time it had nothing to do with footsteps in the corridor. The response came before dawn. Petra woke me at 4 with a folded paper that her brother had ridden back with through the night, having passed the original message to the Home Secretary's private secretary in London at midnight. The reply was brief, written in a hand I didn't know, and it said 3 things: that a sealed warrant was being prepared for Colonel Brine, and 2 named associates, that a senior inspector from the Home Secretary's office would arrive at Blackmir by midday, and that Director Harwick had been placed on administrative suspension pending investigation, effective as of last evening. I read it twice, then went to find Damien. He was already dressed and in his study, which told me he had not slept either, and when I handed him the paper, he read it standing up with the same stillness he brought to everything, and then he set it on the desk and was quiet for a long moment. "It is not finished," he said. "Gould is still in the village. Drew is still in this house somewhere, and Brine will know within hours, if he does not already know, that something has moved against him." "Which means Gould will move this morning," I said. "Not tonight. This morning. He cannot afford to wait." As if the house itself had heard me, we both heard it at the same moment. The sound of a carriage on the front drive, moving fast, not the measured approach of a morning caller, but the urgent rattle of someone arriving with purpose. We reached the entrance hall at the same time as Lady Bernice, who had appeared from the east corridor in a dressing gown that somehow looked entirely authoritative, and behind her came Mrs. Hadlow and 2 footmen, and, from the back stair, Petra, who had the particular alert look of someone ready to be useful. The front door opened before anyone knocked. Lord Gould stepped inside with Callum Drew directly behind him, and a third man I had not seen before, broader and quieter, with the bearing of someone employed specifically for situations that required a third man. Gould looked at Damien. He looked at me. He looked at the paper in my hand, and something in his expression told me he already knew. Not about the warrant, about the message, about the fact that the evening's moves had already been made and he was arriving too late to the board. But Gould was a man who had survived a long time in dangerous places by never letting a situation close on him without making one final push. And so he said, with the smoothest composure I had ever seen on a man who had already lost, "I am here for the documents, Ashcroft. Whatever arrangement you have made, I am offering something better." "There is nothing you can offer," Damien said. "Your freedom," said Gould. "Your name. The quiet burial of every disputed element of your history. Brine can deliver that. He has the reach." He paused. "You hand us the copies. We walk away. You keep everything you have built here." The entrance hall was very still. Mrs. Hadlow stood like a post. The footman did not move. Lady Bernice watched her nephew with the patient certainty of a woman who knew exactly what he would say. Damien looked at Gould for a moment that was almost gentle in its quietness. "Get out of my house," he said. Gould nodded once, slowly, and then he looked at the third man, and the third man reached into his coat. I was already moving. I crossed the hall in 4 steps, put myself between the third man and Damien, and had the constable device out, and pressed against the third man's collarbone before his hand had cleared his pocket. The entrance hall went completely silent. Drew did not move. Gould did not move. The third man looked down at the device against his chest and went very still. "Hands in the air," I said. Gould looked at me with an expression that was almost, in some distant academic way, admiring. "Countess," he said, "you are making a significant mistake." "Take your hand out of your coat," I said to the third man, slowly, "and then put both hands where I can see them." He did. Damien stepped up beside me. Not in front. Beside. The distinction was not small. "Petra," he said, without raising his voice. "Yes, Your Grace." "Go to the village. Tell the constable there are trespassers at Blackmir who have declined to leave when asked. Tell him to bring 2 men." "Yes, Your Grace." She was gone before Gould could object. What followed was 22 of the most uncomfortable minutes I had ever spent in a room, and I had once spent 40 minutes locked in a document vault in Brussels with a man who had been paid to ensure I did not come out. Gould stood near the door with the precise, arranged stillness of a man conserving his remaining dignity. Drew looked at the floor. The third man stood with his hands visible and his expression blank. Lady Bernice sat on the hall bench as though she were waiting for a particularly dull social call to end. Damien stood exactly where he had been standing, and I kept the device out. And no one said anything at all. But the village constable arrived with 2 men and a great deal of confusion, which became considerably less confusing when Damien showed him the administrative warrant that had arrived with Petra's brother's return message, naming Gould as a person of interest in an active Home Secretary investigation. Gould left in the constable's cart. Drew left behind him. The third man, who turned out not to be armed after all, which was either very brave or very poorly prepared, left on foot. The front door closed. The entrance hall exhaled. Lady Bernice stood up from the bench, smoothed her dressing gown, and said to Mrs. Hadlow, "I believe we will have breakfast early this morning. Something hot." She looked at me. "You will stay for breakfast, Countess." It was not a question. I found I did not mind at all. The Home Secretary's inspector arrived at 11:30, a precise and serious woman named Inspector Gail Morrow, who shook my hand with the grip of someone who had read my bureau file and decided she approved, and who spent 3 hours with Damien at the study table, going through everything in methodical order. I sat through most of it and answered questions when asked, and watched Damien lay down, piece by piece, the weight he had been carrying for 18 months. He did it without theatre, without appeal, with the same flat, careful precision he brought to everything, and every document he named was exactly where he said it was, and every date he gave matched the written record, and by the time Inspector Morrow closed her notebook, she had the look of someone who had arrived expecting a complicated situation and found, underneath all the complexity, something straightforwardly true. "The warrant for Brine will be executed this afternoon," she said. "Gould will be detained pending the investigation. I will need you available for formal testimony within the fortnight, Your Grace." "I will be available," Damien said. She looked at me. "And you, Countess, your report to the Bureau should come to my office directly, not through Harwick's channel." "Understood," I said. She left. Damien walked her to the door and came back and stood in the study doorway, and I was still at the table with the empty space where the documents had been, and the room was the quietest it had been in 4 days. He looked at me across the room, and I looked back at him, and the space between us was not as large as it had once felt. "The 5 days are up," I said. "They are," he agreed. "Inspector Morrow will want me in London." "She will," he said. "Eventually." Something in the way he said that last word was careful and deliberate. The way everything he said that mattered was deliberate. "You mentioned a conversation," I said. "One that did not involve stolen treaties." He crossed the room and stopped in front of me, close enough that I had to look up slightly, and he looked down at me with that reading expression, the one I had started out disliking and had somewhere along 4 days of cold corridors and wet fields and candlelit rooms at 2 in the morning come to find entirely different from what I had first thought it was. He was not reading me like a problem. He was reading me like something he did not want to miss a word of. "Stay another day," he said. "Just one, and we will have it." I thought about the Bureau and my report and the train to London and all the waiting, ordinary machinery of my ordinary life. And then I looked at Damien Ashcroft, who had smiled at a weapon pressed to his chest and asked for more, who had carried a dead woman's hope and a country's secret for 18 months without breaking, who had stood beside me in an entrance hall that morning and not in front of me, and I thought, very simply, that the train to London would run tomorrow just as well as today. "One day," I said. He did not smile exactly, but the stillness in his face shifted into something warm and unguarded, something I suspected very few people had ever been given the chance to see. Outside the study window, the Blackmir grounds were grey and wet and enormous, and somewhere in the village a constable's cart was carrying Lord Gould toward a reckoning that had been a long time coming, and somewhere in a vestry floor safe a dead woman's words were finally doing what she had always meant them to do. Eleanor Ashcroft had written on that envelope, for when he breaks, he had not broken. He had opened. There was a difference, and I understood now that she had known that too, and had chosen the word carefully, the way people do when they love someone well enough to be honest. I picked up my notebook and my pen, and Damien sat across the table from me, and the fire was warm, and the house was quiet, and for the first time since I had stepped out of a hired carriage 4 days ago and pressed a device to the chest of a man who would not flinch, everything felt exactly the right size. That was how it ended. And how quietly, and without any of the fanfare that the Bureau would have preferred, something else entirely began. Now I have to ask you this before you go. Thea stayed. Would you have? After all of that, after the danger and the sleepless nights, and a man who looked at you like you were the most interesting thing he had ever encountered, would you have taken that one extra day? Drop your answer in the comments and tell us where you are watching from. If this story moved you, please hit the subscribe button right now because stories like this one deserve to be heard. Thank you for staying until the very end.